Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the RH podcast. Got your co host here, Ryan Fugit, former CIA officer and Army veteran. I'm joined by a good friend, Glenn Korn, who many of you know now, multi time chief of station, 34 years in the US government, with most of that time at CIA. And we are here to deconstruct all things international security. And today, of course, is Trump, Zelensky, meetings in DC following this very interesting past weekend of the meetings with Putin in Alaska. So, Glenn, welcome. Where are you calling in from?
Great to see you again, Ryan, and to see all the subscribers and viewers, even though I can't see them, but I'm imagining them. I'm calling in from the Institute of World Politics, where I teach and just taught a course, and I'm in one of the classrooms. So, based in DC, Washington, DC.
Can we ask, what is the course that people are getting from former COS extraordinaire that they probably don't appreciate enough?
I am teaching a course on home cooking, how to make an egg. I couldn't do that. I'm teaching a course on this semester on Turkish national security.
Okay, let's get to the business.
I said, okay, Brian.
Yeah, Brian Fugit here.
What are you drinking in that white cup? I don't want to know.
I have a Hefeweizen from Munich.
Oh, it's sehr good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. What a nice Überraschung.
Yeah. All right. So
Okay.
Trump, Zelensky today, a little bit of reporting that's come out, which is ceasefire still is not necessary. There's some U.S. guarantees for Ukraine's security. Need to forego NATO membership, but they could get NATO style or NATO like support or security guarantees.
Right.
What else has happened that we should share with people? And then we'll jump into the analysis here.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I mean, let's start with this. I find this very interesting. NPR ran an article, I think over the weekend, that somebody at the meetings in Alaska left a schedule. And I'm sure you were involved when you were overseas and organizing like these VIP visits, and they put out the schedule, which you're not supposed to like share with people. And so somebody made a mistake and left it in a hotel room, and it was found, and some journalists got their hands on it, and they had the schedule, the original schedule for the meetings in Alaska. And what I find interesting is what didn't happen in Alaska. And so I want to unpack that a little bit if I can, if I may.
Yeah, let's do it.
On the schedule, first of all, there was supposed to be a tete-a-tete meeting between Trump and Putin. That didn't happen. The meeting included Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff and Sergei Lavrov and Ushakov, right? So that was interesting. And by the way, I think that was a smart move by the president not to do a one-on-one. I think it was good to have his advisors in there with him.
Glenn, did they not have time together in the moticade? Just the two of them?
They did in the Beast, like in the, but I mean, what are you going to talk about there? You know, who picked the mixtape? Who decided on Barry Manilow for the ride from the plane to the meeting spot? Like, I don't think that's very significant. And some of the hoopla in the media, I think, is a little silly about that. Like, what could they really discuss? But the actual meeting. So what didn't happen was there was supposed to be a lunch, and at the lunch, the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Treasury were scheduled to be at that lunch. And my understanding is they were in Alaska, but the lunch was canceled. And I find that interesting because, you know, if you think about it, Trump is probably sending the message that if you are ready to make a deal and agree to a ceasefire, we can talk about like rolling back sanctions and maybe doing some business. So you have the Secretary of Treasury there, right person, Secretary of Commerce. But Putin didn't do that. And so there was no lunch. There was no engagement, from what I can tell, between the Secretary of Commerce and his Russian counterpart, or whoever Putin had from his side. Maybe it was Dmitriev. And then, you know, there was supposed to be another meeting. I think the total number of like hours for meetings was 6 hours. It was under 3 hours. Putin left without the state lunch, like the presidential hosted lunch. And I think that's very interesting. Like, it tells me that the president decided there's no point in having this lunch and having that wider engagement because you're not ready to make the deal that I want, right? So now,
so it's a bit of a stick in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I've said this before, there has to be a carrot and a stick. And I think that, you know, he was probably offering the carrot. Putin didn't take it. And so, I wouldn't call it like a bad, like, uh, how do I say, like a super rough stick, but I think there was a message there. And there's definitely like, we're not going to reward you for not agreeing to a ceasefire by giving you like a meeting with the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of Commerce, two very, very important people in a country which is the economic powerhouse, the United States, and to a country that needs economic help, Russia, right? Given the state of their economy, which is not good. So that's one. Two, my understanding is after the meetings, it was announced that the Russians, for the first time, agreed to some form of security guarantee for Ukraine as part of a settlement. And if I'm not mistaken, that the United States could be part of that agreement, which is what the president and the European leaders and Zelensky were talking about today. What would that look like? That to me is very significant. Now we have to be careful. I personally don't trust Putin. He's definitely been manipulative before, said things before, and then, gone back on his word, deceived people, no doubt about it. But that is a positive step because it's something that the Ukrainians have said for a long time now. Like for any kind of agreement, we have to have some kind of security guarantee. And now we go to the third point. Let's remember, because the president is taking some heat for not announcing secondary sanctions immediately after the meeting in Alaska. But let's be realistic. He met with Putin on Friday. Was it Friday or Thursday? Friday.
Friday. Yep.
Friday. Sorry, my dates are all mixed up. Uh, and then he met with Zelensky in the White House on Monday with our European partners. And I also think that's very, very important. There's a lot of talk about, the Europeans were here to provide support to Zelensky, but people seem to act as if the White House, the US government, did not have to agree to have the Europeans here. They were the guests of the White House. And from what I saw, there was a very good meeting. The rapport between Zelensky and Trump was very good. A lot of people were worried we were going to have another February disaster. It was not that. It was very good. There was a lot of rapport, positive rapport. And then there was a meeting with our European partners, the leaders of some of the most important European countries, again, and multilateral organizations. And again, the mood was very good. The interaction seemed to be very good. I think the one point of contention or maybe disagreement is on the ceasefire. I think the German chancellor, raised the issue of we need a ceasefire. Let's put pressure on Moscow to agree to a ceasefire. I think the president was not non-committal to that. And he said, we've done other peace agreements without having a ceasefire. And I think that's probably still going to have to be worked out. But coming out of this, I just read in the media that now President Trump called Putin, and there will be a meeting now between Zelensky and Putin. And then after that meeting, a meeting with Zelensky, Putin, and President Trump. So I'm sorry for talking so much.
That was great. Why no ceasefire? Like what? That's I think Russia's position. Why do they not want to have a ceasefire at this point?
I think because the Russians, one, it's like a negotiating tactic for them. They know that it's something which is very problematic for the Ukrainians and for the West. So this is something they can use to apply pressure. Two, we've said this before in the last discussion we had, they want to take as much territory as they can and inflict as much damage as they can on the Ukrainians. Of course, the Ukrainians are inflicting damage on the Russians as well. So the Ukrainians have, they're giving, I'd say, as much, well, they're giving quite a bit back. What they're not doing is they're not attacking civilian targets like the Russians are, which is heinous, right? But the Russians, I think they see this as something that they're going to hold out there. Like, we're not going to give you a ceasefire until we get something we really want. And the other significant thing today is President Zelensky said, we're ready to discuss like a land swap, some kind of negotiation of territory, which is also very significant. So obviously the devil's in the details on all of these issues. There have to be more discussions. There has to be more engagement. I saw the meetings today a lot of people were very worried going into the meetings today. And when I'm almost giddy that they seemed so positive. So I'm going to take a win for a win, right? I'm going to be happy for today. I was very worried I was going to be very depressed.
And that's because of the potential repeat from earlier this year, that it could have been an outcome like that.
It could have been an outcome like that, or I think now the ball's in Putin's court. The pressure's on Putin because President Trump called him and said, "Okay, time for a meeting." And if Putin had said no, like he did before, remember in May, he refused to go to Istanbul to meet with Zelensky and Erdogan and President Trump, who offered to come from. He was in the Middle East in the Gulf, and he said, "I'll come." And Putin said no. Now Putin's apparently saying yes. That tells me that he's under pressure. He knows, like, there's some leverage over him that can be applied and cause him pain.
Given what we've heard now coming out of Friday and now Monday, do you feel the outcome of this is going to change slightly? Like maybe there's no ceasefire, but probably still some type of land swap. I know one of the contingent or one of the negotiating positions, I think, from Putin on Friday was in addition to land they've taken in parts of Ukraine, they wanted additional land in those particular provinces
Right.
as well that had not been taken by them, which is obviously another maximalist negotiating tactic. Makes sense. But anything from your end on now going forward with what we know might change the outcome.
Well, I do see the Russians are backing off some of the the red lines that they had, or the maximalist positions they had. So there's room, I think, for a negotiation and for an agreement that they're not going to get. And if I were and it's my personal opinion, if I were the Ukrainians, I would say, like I've said this before, in Zaporozhye, no, we're not going to give you Zaporozhye. You have to evacuate Zaporozhye, right? If you want this war to stop, because this war is just as painful for you as it is for us. We're not the only people suffering. Like in Kherson. And, I've said this before too. I think that the Ukrainians, they're they're indicating they're ready to talk about like how they can make a deal with the Russians to end this thing. And that may require them to have to cede some territory. But I think that that should be, in my own opinion, temporary. They should never agree that that territory belongs to the Russian Federation because it was part of Ukraine and it should be considered part of Ukraine. And hopefully, the United Nations will recognize that. And in the international courts and in other multilateral venues, the Ukrainians can continue to argue that that is their territory.
Okay.
Another
Yeah.
another
Fair.
big issue was discussed today was like getting back the Ukrainian children that have been kidnapped by the Russians, and that has to be. I think it was the commissioner from the EU who said that. Like, she said, "I'm a mother and a grandmother," and the idea that, like, children could be kidnapped, we need to, like, get those kids back to their families, right?
What about this stipulation that came from the Russian side that they want the Russian Orthodox Church to be, I don't know if it was the dominant religion or present in these territories that they could potentially be ceded?
Yeah. This is a super complicated, and it's a piece of propaganda the Russians have used, in my opinion, for a long time now. They have used the Russian Orthodox Church as a weapon, in Ukraine. By the way, they've done it in other places. They use it to support their intelligence operations. They use it to promote propaganda. And so and in the United States and in Europe, they've been promoting the idea that the Ukrainians are anti-church because they raided some of the Orthodox churches and they put restrictions on the Orthodox Church. And you probably remember the Ukrainian Orthodox Church separated from the Russian Orthodox Church, from the patriarch, and the Russians obviously don't like that. The patriarch in Russia, who is a former KGB agent, they
Is
didn't
that
like.
right? I did not know this, Glenn.
Yeah, yeah. And so, for your listeners, one of the only cases that I am aware of an ethnic Russian American committing espionage for the Soviet Union was a army lieutenant colonel who was retired, who was recruited by his Orthodox priest in Germany. Okay. So the Russians use the church for political purposes, unfortunately, right? And I'm not saying that all Orthodox, Russian Orthodox church followers or believers are Russian agents. No, I'm not saying that, and we should never say that. But the Russians, unfortunately, have kind of weaponized the church, and the Ukrainians have taken steps to defend themselves from the church and its kind of negative influence for Ukraine. And I think the Russians are just trying to promote this idea. It's like they're saying, like, you have to, Russia has to be an official language in Ukraine. Then I guess the Ukrainians can say, okay, Ukrainian has to be an official language in Russia, right? I mean, It's kind of crazy to me, but this is again, I think this is just what the Russians are doing. They're trying to throw roadblocks in the way and stumbling blocks, make it that much harder to come to a deal so they can continue to buy time, grab territory, and stave off the sanctions or more sanctions.
You had mentioned earlier Zaporizhia and Kherson. So why those two places? Well, like, why does that come to mind for you as potential red lines for them,
For the
even if
Ukrainians,
they've been occupied? Yeah,
because the Russians haven't occupied all of that territory, right? And so they're saying like just have to give it up to
I
us.
see.
And you're saying we're not going to do it. We're fighting for our territory. And I don't like we won't go into all the historic back and forth, but there are probably some territories that are almost fully occupied by the Russians, and then there are some that are not. And why would the Ukrainians agree to just hand over a bunch of territory that they've defended, they've protected,
Yeah,
and
agree.
it's being occupied by the Russians? The Russians should leave those territories, in my opinion, for a deal.
My prediction here is NATO membership is like the incredibly hard red line for the Russians. Do you see that changing? Like Ukraine being allowed to do that?
Well, maybe eventually it's going to take a long time. I don't think as long as Putin's in power, like he's going to agree to that. He'll continue to cause mischief. Um, but in the the immediate future, I think what the Ukrainians really need is a guarantee, like a realistic guarantee, not a guarantee from Moscow because we know what that's worth, right?
Yeah.
They need a guarantee from like the Europeans, and a big role. What that role will be for the U.S. is not clear, but the U.S. has to be behind that, and they have to feel confident that it's not going to be another Budapest Accord where it was just, okay, well, we had an agreement, but we're just going to turn the other way. No, it's got to be the Russians understand if you try and encroach again on Ukrainian territory after an agreement is made, you will pay a very serious price, and you're going to have to fight not just the Ukrainians, but the Europeans and the U.S.
Other hot take, do you see the Ukrainians losing Crimea at the end of this? I should say I feel like that is going to be lost ground, sadly, but I'm curious your take on it.
Yeah, I would just say again, I am hopeful that over time they can take Crimea,
Temporary. Yeah. Okay. I like
right?
that.
Right, and I'm hopeful if that's what they want back, then they should continue to argue for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything we missed on what's happened so far with Russia and Ukraine in these recent meetings?
No, I think the question now is where is the meeting between Zelensky and Putin going to take place, the bilateral, and then where would the trilateral take place? And that will be interesting too. Well, it can go back to like some of the third country options that we talked about before, Turkey. By the way, what's interesting today is like, where was President Erdogan? He wasn't at the White House. Even though he's been promoting like a peace deal, he's been one of the only presidents that's been speaking with, NATO leaders who's been speaking with Putin since 2022. And he's always argued that you have to maintain a dialogue, like a channel of communication. Um, so that was a question I had today. Like, okay, that's interesting. UAE, my understanding is they want it to be, or they've offered to be the place for negotiations. Maybe Switzerland, maybe some other locations. Maybe let's think out of the box. Maybe somewhere in Asia, maybe in Latin America. Who knows?
Interesting. Okay.
Anything goes these days, right? Right. And then yes, if Putin and Zelensky meet, how's that going to go?
And did I fact check me on this, Glenn? I
Mm-hmm.
thought I read today that President Trump had mentioned in a discussion he had with the Chinese leader Xi that he had promised President Trump in the past, or at least stated, that he would not invade Taiwan on Trump's watch.
I read that in the news today too, somewhere, right? That he made that promise.
Thoughts on that from a life in USG looking at threats around the world?
To quote the great Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. So, yeah, I wouldn't take that at face value. I mean, maybe I don't think the Chinese want to invade Taiwan. Really, they want to take it without having to go to war. Right, that's without having to use military action. So they'll try and like get it that way. And I should say too, because I'm not a great China expert at all. On Russia, we should remember we may be now at the spot where we were in 2019, 2018, where Russia was occupying parts of Ukraine, including Crimea, the Donbass. They were promoting a civil war with their surrogate forces, their little green men, right? The Wagner troops. They were conducting sabotage. They were, doing massive propaganda, disinformation against the Ukrainians, and they were doing cyber attacks. So you can go down the list of what the Russians call active measures. A lot of people in the US say like gray zone operations. We're probably going back to that space. Zelensky was meeting with Putin before. He was talking with Putin. And Zelensky, when he came to power, by the way, he was the president that ran on a ticket of peace. Like we need to have like a dialogue with Russia. So we may be back in that space very soon. It does not mean that the struggle's over. And I would suggest that the war is not over. And I hate to say that because nobody wants to be at war, but it'll just be war back into that gray zone. And we need to be aware of that. And the Ukrainians are aware of it.
So, question on that. When you say gray zone and active measures, I suppose I think of it more as some sabotage here or there, information operations, but maybe not counterinsurgency or guerrilla type warfare. Is that what you think? Like, I would assume if you're Ukraine and you lose this ground and it's occupied by Russia, you are actively fighting from within there.
I would suggest that the Russians will do things like try to encourage groups inside of Ukraine, like regionally, to try and separate some of the regions from Kiev, to encourage separatism, to look at different ethnic groups in Ukraine and try and get them spun up.
All
Uh,
from an information perspective, Glenn, or you think there
from an
is some
information, from funding, from maybe arming them, manipulating them, political action. I think anything is going to be on the table, and we have to be well aware of that. One of the things the Russians are going to try and do, and they've been doing this since 2000. Well, they've been doing it since 1991. It's definitely since 2014, trying to discourage like Western companies from doing business in Ukraine, promoting the narrative of corruption. Um, they are good. They don't want Ukraine to recover, and they don't want Ukraine to prosper, and that's very unfortunate. As long as Vladimir Putin is the president of Russia, I think that's going to be the policy, which hurts Russia, but
totally, yeah.
zero-sum game mentality.
What about Zelensky or Ukraine going the other direction? Should they not be doing the same in occupied territory?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things I think the difference between 2014 or let's say pre-2022 and today is the Ukrainians have showed they have a very good capability to strike back. And the Russians should be well aware of that. The Ukrainians are conducting operations inside of Russia very effectively. And so if the Russians want to continue like the gray zone operations, I think the Ukrainians have shown they're very capable of doing the same. So maybe that will be a deterrent again, like for the Russians. Maybe that will convince them. Maybe we should just, slow down, ease up, try a different way.
I doubt it, but I feel like Ukraine has to be ready to go hard into that space.
I doubt it too, but like sometimes I want to be positive, and you're drinking a Hefeweizen, and who would ever thought that the president of France and the chancellor of Germany would be sitting in the White House with the U.S. president to like try and bring peace to another part of Europe. In 1939 and 1943 and even probably 50, nobody would really think that way. So maybe they say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Those lyrics. That was John, not Vladimir Lenin. Lenin never sang that song. Imagine. But but maybe over time, but the Russians need to. I used to argue this to the Russians all the time. Look at Europe, like Europe, integrated Europe, the countries that were warring, the Germans and the French forever. Now they're doing business together. And as one German told me once, like it makes no sense for us to go to war with France anymore because we'd be blowing up our own factories. Right?
Which you and I talked about last time. Why would Russia go in and even start this war? And it's so harmful to growth for them and prosperity and opportunity. And it's Putin wanting to do it.
Well, we probably have to ask ourselves too. We're going to be controversial, but like, why? Why didn't they see that, like, the benefit of kind of integrating economically trade? Some Russians would say because we were like shunned or we were kept out of the mix. I don't know if that's true, but again, like I talk about the carrot, if the Russians start doing things, this is a criticism I have of the US policy over the last, let's say, 10 years, maybe more. We we haven't really explained what the carrot is, right? Either we talk in kind of mushy terms or we talk about sanctions and punishment. But what is the reward if Russia does something positive? What if they pull their troops out of, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Luhansk? What are we going to do?
Lift sanctions and secondary sanctions, I would
Okay,
think,
okay. Then we lift sanctions,
which is a carrot. I think. I mean,
but you're going to get a lot of opposition for people to do that, right? So, like, politically in the United States and in Europe, you're going to hear a lot, and of course, the Ukrainians are going to say you can't do that because, like, they have to be punished for what they did. So it's just going to be very complicated.
mhm.
It's not going to be easy. The work on this is not going to be done, let's say, in 3 months if a peace agreement is signed. There's going to be a lot more work to be done, which is fine. I mean, that's the way the world is.
Some great comments on our last videos. One was, "This is too good for something that's free to listen to. Fantastic discussion. Very important coverage on what has been going on, what will be going on, and what will become of it. Thank you both. Thanks for having Glenn on again, Brian. So you are the focal point there. Great if you could have him back on as a regular monthly guest, which is awesome. But I'm going to find a very funny comment that someone left for us because I need to get your take on it. One person said, "Former CIA guys, might you recruit me here and I'll go get you high value secrets."
I saw that one. A little late, guy. Sorry.
You're too late. All right, here it is. "We could easily find a solution to all of this if we simply looked back at the great and historic Cold War documentary Spies Like Us and used the negotiation strategy that Emmett Fitzhume so strategically employed." That is from Valor Arc Designs. That was the best comment I've seen in a long time. So my question, Glenn, you have obviously seen Spies Like Us.
Yes.
I mean, just like, what are your thoughts on that movie?
Great movie. Great. I mean, like, you can't even take it apart. Like, there's so many great. My favorite scene is when the KGB guys capture Chevy Chase in the Tajik border. And he's like, "For every minute you don't answer a question, I cut off a finger. Yours or mine?" Right? And he slaps him. He goes, "What are you hitting me for? That hurts." And he says, "Why are you here? Who sent you here? Why are you here?" He says, "Why am I here? Why are you here?" I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre that said. But let me refer to another movie, which I think goes a little bit like back more in history, but every American should watch. And it's called "The Russians Are Coming, the Russians Are Coming." It's a great, I don't know if you ever seen it, Ryan. It's a great,
I've not, no.
from the 1960s. Alan Arkin, who, by the way, was a fluent Russian speaker, grew up speaking Russian. Alan Arkin, great actor. Um, oh God, what's his name? Jonathan Winters, who my mother knew, and I'll tell you that story offline sometime. Like, my mother was an actress and a singer, so she knew Jonathan Winters. Said he was one of the funniest human beings ever, and he was. And a whole other cast. But one of the things in this movie, it was made in the '60s at the kind of right after, like, the height of the Cold War, let's say. And the idea of the movie was, like, Russians and Americans, like, are so scared of each other that they can get crazy and hysterical. But at the end of the day, they're human beings, right? But there's a famous scene where this Russian submarine gets stuck off, like, some island, like Nantucket or somewhere in the New England. And the captain of the submarine sends a team to the island to steal a boat so they can try and pull them off the sandbar. And Alan Arkin leads this team. They go into the town, and there's like this escapades, like stupidity. The town goes on alert. They figure out, they think they're being invaded by Russia. The militia, like, the commander of the militia is like a World War I vet. He has a broken sword. It's like very, but there's a famous scene where at the end, the submarine comes into the harbor, and the captain of the submarine has, like, the deck gun trained on this village, like all the people in the village, and they all have their shotguns and their I don't know, blunderbuss or whatever, that they're ready to shoot the submarine. And the captain, there's like a standoff. And the sheriff, I forget the name of the actor, but great actor. The sheriff, like, he stands, like, he goes toe to toe with this captain, and the captain threatens to shoot him. And the sheriff says, "You're under arrest." He starts to write him a citation for parking a submarine illegally or something. And he, like, captain says, "If you don't, like, do this, like, I'm going to fire on you." And the sheriff of the town basically says, "If you don't think I'm scared, but I'm not going to back down." Right. And then, like, the Russians kind of back down. And then I'm not gonna go through the whole story. I won't waste your audience's time or our audience's time, but it's a great movie. I recommend everybody, like, watch it. And that one scene in particular, like, I did something on LinkedIn where I posted that, and I said, like, every U.S. official that deals with Russia should watch that one scene.
Really?
Yeah.
Just because of the de-escalation?
The guy stood up, the sheriff, that's like America to me. He said, "Listen, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm scared. Like, you may blow me up, but I'm not going to back down. Like, I'm doing the right thing. I'm going to stand my ground." And the United States needs to stand its ground with Ukraine, in my opinion, on this. Let the Russians de-escalate. Let the Russians make some serious compromises. And then maybe we can have a better relationship with Russia in the future, where the Russians could benefit. Because I say this all the time. The Russians are the ones that are suffering as a result of this war. Not as much as the Ukrainians, unfortunately, but they are suffering. And it's shameful what their leadership is doing, my opinion.
All
Yeah.
right,
All right.
Glenn, thanks so much. We appreciate it. I know it's late where you are. And I don't know where we'll see you next time, what classroom you'll be in, or maybe you're somewhere else overseas, but looking forward to it.
Well, we'll find another issue. I'm sure the world will bring us something to talk about, and we'll find some people interesting. I find interesting people all the time to talk to. I was in the Home Depot yesterday, and I don't know how this happened, but there was a guy from the Middle East with his sons, and I was buying a shelf for my house, and he starts talking to me, and then he says, "Oh, have you seen me on TV? I'm a big expert on, like, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia. I'm a commentator. I was a political scientist and
Only in Northern Virginia could that happen.
at Home Depot."
Yeah,
And he's like a Middle East expert, and he's asking me if I want him to come to my house and help put in a shelf.
that's great.
Yes.
Okay.
Come on.
All right, Glenn. Thank you so much.